Thank you. I would try to go fairly quickly, even though I'm not feeling well. I didn't sleep much, and I didn't eat any chocolate today, which is the worst part of that. I sort of feel like the odd one out in a way here, that I'm going to talk about what in a way is the tiniest of tiny markets compared to what you've all been talking about today. But I think it's one that's very important to a lot of people, and as we know, the proportion of what's called fine cacao in the world, or the fine cacao producing countries, is not insignificant, even if it is not the major player. So I'm going to try and cover points about this little niche market, which I think is somehow leading the way and offers maybe a different model for chocolate eating and cacao production, albeit that might not be that large at any point, but we will see. So let's hope the clicker works. Those are some of the things I'm involved with, and I'm only showing those because almost everything I do is somehow involved in taste and flavor, and it's very much about seeing chocolate and good cacao more in the context of a fine wine. But I want to pose a question, really. Let's talk about fine cacao and which countries have it and what is it and things. So exactly what is fine cacao for? There's a lot of discussion about pricing and quality and things. What is the reason we have this stuff? Well, fine cacao is used, I think, in sort of commercial recipes to add that little bit of flavour. It's a bit like whiskey blending. If you get Johnny Walker Red Label, it's mostly green spirit with a little bit of sort of single cask kind of special whiskies added to it. So I think there's that usage. In more large-scale origin and blended chocolate production, so I think that's the sort of Calbo chef range, Lindt with their origins, the origin ranges of Calbo, Belcolade, some of these companies. Small factory-produced origin chocolate. Now, what I mean by small factory is, to us in our world, quite a big factory. So this is the Valronas, and then perhaps a bit down from that, the Michel Clazel's. There's sort of a handful of these companies around the world. And then we've got, this is the new thing that's really taken off in the last 5 or 6 years. This is the idea of micro-batch chocolate making. This is people who now can buy a machine at home that processes 3 kilos or something, or in a small unit which processes 20 kilos or 30 kilos or 50 kilos, tiny, tiny, tiny amounts in the context we've been talking about today. But still, I think having a significant influence, a definite market and an influence on consumers. But asking again, what is fine cacao for? Well, I want to be more specific. And for me, fine cacao is for one purpose and one purpose only. Otherwise, to me, there's no point in having it. We might as well just all have bulk cocoa. And that's to make good tasting chocolate. It is about the output. If it's not about the output, that chocolate bar, whatever your definition of that, then why is anyone growing fine cacao? And there will only be a significant market for fine cacao if we understand chocolate bars and chocolate within that context. Now, obviously, everyone has their own definition of good tasting chocolate. That's partly a market-led thing. But this is the number one reason I'm proposing for having fine cacao. Okay, that's easy. That's my opinion, but that was easy. But how do we know if we've got fine cacao? Well, this is a tricky one, which is sort of quite a few people have spent quite a long time trying to work out in various different ways. And we've got things like we've got technical definitions, there's been research, what the market says, because if market researchers say, well, this is premium, this is fine, then that's okay, that's a definition. Things like the final flavour panel of the ICCO. Lots of different things sort of reaching for defining what we mean by fine cacao. But I'll give you another definition. This is my definition of how do we know what fine cacao is. Can it make good tasting chocolate? If it can't make good tasting chocolate, why are we calling it fine? Again, whatever we define good tasting chocolate as. A little more detail. This is a definition which I'll talk about this new organisation we're trying to get going, Direct Cacao, in a bit, but this is coming from Direct Cacao. So we're proposing that fine cacao is capable of being transformed into fine chocolate. Doesn't mean to say it will be. Could go in a whole bunch of products, or maybe it's not processed in the most optimal way, but it is capable of being transformed into fine chocolate that has complexity and richness, definition, has varied or distinctive flavour notes that are in harmony and balance, so maybe it has a good overall mouthfeel, taste, enjoyment, or it has something very distinctive and unusual, which the collectors go for. This is absolutely key, that it has a lingering and clean aftertaste. In the world of wine, this will be very obvious, but persistence aftertaste is absolutely crucial. Most cacao and a lot of dark chocolate bars, I saw the graphs earlier of in the UK we don't like that much dark chocolate. Well, I don't like that much dark chocolate sold in the UK either, because it doesn't have this cleanness to it. And this is the most important thing, that it is free of defects that take away your enjoyment. Things like mold and bad fermentation, contamination, undesirable things, contamination that could happen at any stage of the process of the post-harvest, down to the wrapping of the bar or the storage in your corner shop or something. But these are all absolutely crucial in having a fine cacao. And I'd also posit this, that this is an absolute for me, is that fine chocolate can only be made from fine cacao. That's the definition of it. And much as people have tried to come along and say, well, this is a great tasting chocolate bar using this special fermentation of some bulk cocoa varieties, maybe that will happen in the future, but as yet it's not really happened. So those things are sort of mutual definitions, really. So a bit more, how do we know what fine cacao is? Well, the bottom line of that is by tasting. And as humans, we all have this wonderful, fantastic, underused instrument where we can taste flavors. And that's the fundamental reason why we pay more or pay for treats and special foods and things, because they have a taste for us, an enjoyment factor. But you might say taste is subjective. Well, I think many of the experts in the room who are involved in cacao, liquor tasting, would say yes and maybe no. Yes, it is a matter of your opinion, but there are certain definites which we can come along and define, which I think most people would agree with. So this is where tasting protocols come in. And these are fundamentary to any sensory analysis. All throughout the cocoa chain, in one way or another, there is some kind of sensory analysis involved. So we can't say taste is not important. Our own taste, our human taste, is not yet replaceable. There are some neural networking computer chips or devices being developed which might be able to somehow emulate, but at the moment we're still important. And there's no evaluation or flavour assessment without tasting. So we can't get to an idea. How can we describe the flavour of something without tasting it and without having a protocol to do that? So that's establishing really that tasting is an important part of the industry. And we like to call this idea, it's subjective, but it's a kind of managed subjectiveness. We're taking the idea that this is opinion, but we're controlling that in some ways and setting up certain sort of key factors which we might describe as negatives, and then we can sort of play with the taste and flavours that we like. And this is one way, one of the many things like the Cocoa of Excellence or Heirloom Cacao, all these different projects going on, prizes, things like chocolate awards and things. That's one way of helping to identify what would be commonly agreed to be good tasting chocolate or chocolate products. One thing, I want to quickly show you this, I won't spend much time on it, but one thing I really noticed coming into origin chocolate and dark chocolate, which is my sort of route into this, is there was no particularly comprehensive or good flavour map diagram which explained the possible flavour notes in chocolate. And as I found out more and met more of you and got more involved in the cacao industry, that seems to be the case in the whole industry. And we have many things like these kind of wheels, tasting wheels, which sort of suggest a circular connection without having one, or spider diagrams, which often sort of include superfluous points. So we've been working for some time on a new flavour profiling system, which is not quite ready, but we're hoping to have out in the wild quite soon. initially aimed at origin chocolate bars, but applicable in many ways. So I'm just going to give you a quick preview of that. And this is based on the idea of, as humans, we can, when we identify something like a chair or a photo or something, we only need to absorb a few aspects to understand what it is. We don't spend all our time analysing the chair has blue fabric and 4 legs and things. We go, that's the chair. And we do this kind of with everything, otherwise our senses will be overloaded. So we can very quickly go, maximum 5 taste is enough to profile food or chocolate, especially if you get a big group of people doing this. And although you get the idea that people disagree on what flavours are in anything, but we often find that actually they're just tasting them in different order. So you might taste cherry as your main taste, but that might be my which is number 5, the biggest and first one, that might be my number 2 or something. Also, the idea of this map is it's not just random. This is based on some research papers we found looking at chemicals found in cocoa powder and the aromas associated with those. So that's what this is based on. And it's actually a neural network based on 2 postulated principal components. I won't go into that more, but it does give us a very simple, consumer-friendly diagram where we've got quite obvious spicy, fruity, molasses, earthy, chocolatey in the middle, but it gives us a lot of nuance as well. There's also the possibility with this of it being culturally translated, so you could have flavours which are relevant in China or Japan or Latin America, maybe in slightly different positions, but you could come up with the same kind of flavour profile. I won't spend much more on that, but I just wanted to show you the kind of thing we're looking at. So for me, flavour is all about value and pricing. So how do we create value with flavour? And I would suggest that the value comes from the appreciation of nuanced flavour. If you respect something, you value it more, you're prepared to spend more, you take more time with it. Very true with wine. If you spend 30 euros on a bottle of wine, you're not going to drink it at a party in sort of 2 minutes. So fine chocolate, it must be taken seriously. And this is the idea of not to be eaten like candy, because that's what candy wants to be eaten like, which is fine. But if we're going to get into more nuanced origin chocolate, then it's important how we eat it. Again, this is the wine analogy. An expensive wine we don't chug down in one go. So this is how you approach the chocolate is pretty important. And we need to build up this kind of whole world of sommeliers, experts, geeks, authors, bloggers, people who enjoy this kind of chocolate. Again, you might say, well, this is small and insignificant, but we could look at the world of whiskey, where you can go in the UK, there are many whiskey shows every year, where people pay a lot of money to go in, get a little drunk, but they're going to go and sample a lot of different whiskey. And chocolate's a lot cheaper than that, I should say. And we need to have this more sophisticated language and tools and understanding of this if we're going to help convince consumers. And this is through tastings, events, courses. But I think this is a really important point, is changing consumers' mental price points. The perfect example for me is the average price for a cappuccino in London now is £2.50. When I was a kid, coffee was Nescafe, it was instant, it was 15p or something. The value has completely changed. There are specialty coffee shops, but we have all the chains, Starbucks, Costa, Nero, Pret, they're all there, and millions of people in the UK every day go and spend that money for a coffee. So it's kind of changing the thinking that, well, it's not £2 for a 100 gram bar, because that's not a viable price for any cacao sauce. It's £5 for an 80 gram bar, and that's where this little bit of the market needs to move. And also I would say that this idea of flavour is key in the whole chain. In wine, this is much more obvious because most winemakers also have vineyards, they're very close to it, they have control of the whole process. We have a distance, usually, with cacao and chocolate, but it's important that there's an understanding of that flavour in fine cacao and chocolate all through the chain. So, looking at this more flavour-driven price model, and I would suggest is the only possible future for high-end cacao, because if we don't have something where consumers will pay more to get better chocolate, then it's very hard to sustain a higher price. And this is being proved by some classic countries like Trinidad almost having no production, and places like Dominican Republic having a very small differential between the fermented Hispaniola and the Sanchez cacao, a difference below the cost of fermenting the cacao. Doing this out of kindness or charity is not going to work. That's, you know, all the kind of eco sort of bars. Very often that's private label packaged chocolate, and I don't think that's going to help to create this sort of new model. And also I would say that in fine chocolate, the ethical, sustainable labels are not working for fine cacao and add limited value. And one of the best examples for me was this. I was with Laurent and Moises in Jamaica for a CARIFORUM EU conference earlier in the year, and a representative from Conacado in Dominican Republic, which is one of the sort of biggest fair trade organic co-ops. Before we even got to that part of the discussion, he started his question, and he said, well, for us, these certifications are not working. So we really think that that's a tide that needs turning, and that they're not actually helping in this higher-end priced cacao. What we need is something like much more direct sourcing, much closer contact, a shorter supply chain, not no supply chain. You still need the middlemen, the brokers, all these kind of things going on, the logistics, but there's more direct contact with either end and more of a sort of fair, equal partnership between both ends. Because if you don't do that, why would a farmer bother to look after and grow really good cacao that's very clean and good varieties if he doesn't get paid for it? That is not sustainable. So what the challenges we've got are developing the market. I think an idea I have here is that the actual producers need to go out more and reach the consuming companies, because most of these are very, very small and they don't know very much about cacao or chocolate, but they are the future. You know, there's 100 or more micro-batch makers in the US now. It's taking off in Europe. Some of them started with 30 kilos and they're now on 3 tons, or they get 20 tons. This is a model. They may never be huge, but we've seen this in coffee, we've seen this in beer. And we need a new trade logistical model to make this happen, because the bulk one doesn't work. You can, if you want a container of cocoa, that's very, very cheap. If you want 200 kilos, it costs more to ship it than the cost of the cacao. More challenges on the price. So, as I already mentioned, the price of fine cacao really is too low. And this is about changing consumers' approach and the value again. Because at the current price, I see a real risk that, okay, the bulk market, we might be okay, but in the fine market, if you're a farmer and you have a choice of planting new land with CCM 51 or your indigenous cacao, and there's no differential, why would you do it? And you can ask, some of the co-ops in Peru or something, they're making exactly these decisions right now. And these low differentials are going to get you to the point where you might as well produce bulk, and then that's a difficult market to compete in if you're a small Central American country, for example. And actually, I would say there's an oversupply of high-quality fine cacao. A lot of the development work that I think has been done about quality, productivity, and it needs to be more about marketing. It needs to be convincing end consumers and small buyers why they should pay a price for cacao. We need to grow that market. We could say in coffee, it's estimated about 30% of the coffee market is fine, and that's, you can witness that on the high street. In fine cacao, it's like 2 or 3%, and actually good fine cacao that's going to make a good tasting chocolate bar, we're talking 0.2% or something. So if we want this model to work and to keep the good cacao, that demand needs to be stimulated. So this is creating the realistic-minded consumer market. Again, this goes back to I can't pay €3 for 100 grams of Ecuador-sourced chocolate. It's not a viable model. And so a lot of this is, we want them to teach consumers to understand about flavour and tasting. Exactly, if you're my age and you grew up in the UK, 30 years ago we had red wine and white wine. It was Blue Nun and Black Tower. That's what you could get. Now you can go into Tesco's and you've got a fantastic range of wine. So, we're not going to convince everyone. We're not going to change the whole market, but it needs to be proportionally bigger. And as I say, this might be idealistic. I'm very idealistic about this, but I don't think it's unrealistic for this to grow because it has worked in other areas. Just very quickly about the fine craft chocolate market in a bit more detail. This is, we are talking hundreds of tons at the moment. I think that's growing, but this is tiny at the moment. Then there's the bigger producers like your Valronas, but in the actual micro batch market, very small. So is it relevant? Well, I think one way it is very relevant is you can go to a lot of markets in the UK, for example, and you start to see small micro batch makers there, street food markets and things. So this is going to have an effect. If nothing else, perhaps the lesson from this is the bigger companies, brands will adopt some of this. Because consumers are starting to get interested. The foodies who go to Borough Market or something are beginning to understand what this thing is. So it's bigger than its actual size, and you can now buy a 70% dark chocolate Kit Kat. Again, that was unthinkable when I was a kid. So there is a change in the market. And I would say fine cacao is not viable without that market, because if it's only sold in the commodity market, the price will always be squeezed down. And I don't think that's going to work, especially for the smaller fine countries. I'm just going to talk very quickly now about this thing we're trying to start called Direct Cacao. And this is a trade association of small on either end, and trying to promote direct links between cacao and chocolate producers, and put a common, easy message to consumers, because consumers love a label, and if they see Rainforest Alliance Fair Trade or something, consumers love a label. We should have our own. But important point, not trying to do certification, not to add a cost burden to the chain. This is just labelling that it's been proven through a lawyer has checked that there's contact between both ends of the market, there's some invoices, this kind of thing, that there is communication. We don't want to get charging co-ops, however many thousands, tens of thousands of dollars a year to have a certificate. I think that's the last thing we need in the upper end. But we also need to develop new trade networks and models. This is beginning to happen where some fine cacao producers are bringing cacao into Europe or into the US. So some small chocolate maker starts up, they can make a phone call, or go on the web, they can get a tiny amount of cacao, they can check it, and they can buy the same cacao in 2 months' time when they want to start producing. Helping these things to develop, I think, is key to the survival of the small fine producers. And this is not the answer to everything, completely accept that, but I think it's a piece of the puzzle. The strength of this idea is it's coming from within this fine craft industry. The big challenge is it's from the fine craft industry, and these are mostly 1 or 2 people, businesses, don't have much time, they're all very busy, and it's sort of volunteer time, so it is not a big NGO or something. So we need to find out a way to resource this. This is, I'm advertising now, while remaining independent, and to create real outcomes. I think this is incredibly important from all the sort of development projects I've seen, especially in Latin America, that what we need is, this is a cacao project to create good quality cacao, and that ends up in a bar of chocolate in the consumer's hand at a decent price. So we need help with resourcing, support and collaboration. So if anyone would like to help us develop that, then we very much welcome your support. In my conclusion really is, for me, I'm just being selfish here. I like nice chocolate, I like good chocolate, and I want to keep eating that in my dotage. So, but if we do not pay a high enough price for it, we'll start to lose this stuff, and that's already evidence of that. And the conclusion of my conclusion is, flavour is about value. So, thank you very much.